LSU versus Georgia. This is a really interesting game. Okay, for not a lot of reasons, but just interesting to me because Georgia is a 17.5 point favorite going into this matchup. And you look at LSU. LSU has kind of overachieved this season. I don't really think anybody expected LSU to be playing in the SEC championship game at the start of this season, at least over Alabama. Can LSU keep this game competitive until the fourth quarter? It's the question that I always ask anytime I'm previewing a game that involves Georgia. Because that really is the question. Anytime you play Georgia, can you last until the fourth quarter? Because if you can't, then what's even the point of talking about this game? You get what I'm saying? So it always starts with that. Can LSU make it to the fourth quarter? Now, how can LSU keep this game competitive until the fourth quarter? Well, it's going to come down to one player, and that is Jayden Daniels. Jayden Daniels needs to get back to playing like a superstar if LSU is even going to have a chance at keeping this game close. Against Florida, when LSU went on the road 45-35, Jayden Daniels threw for 349 passing yards, 3 touchdowns. He also had 3 rushing touchdowns. Against Ole Miss, when they beat them 45-20, Jayden Daniels 21-28, 248 passing yards, 2 touchdowns, 121 rushing yards, 3 touchdowns. When LSU upset Alabama in overtime, Jayden Daniels 22-32, 182 passing yards, 2 touchdowns, 95 rush yards, 1 touchdown. When Jayden Daniels plays well, LSU more times than not is winning or they're in a one possession game. However, when Jayden Daniels doesn't play well, you get what you got last week and getting beat by Texas A&M 38-23. Jayden Daniels in that game, 21-35, 189 passing yards, a touchdown. He also had 84 rushing yards. Now, he wasn't awful, but it definitely wasn't as good as the previous 3 performances that he had against Florida, Ole Miss, and Alabama. You want another example? Arkansas. Yeah, weather was a little bit of a factor and whatnot, but at the same time, still could have been a better performance. Wasn't the performances that we saw against Alabama, Ole Miss, and Florida. So if LSU is going to have a chance at keeping this game close and a chance at pulling off this upset, Jayden Daniels, without a doubt, has to ball out. He has to play like a superstar. LSU's offensive line is up and down. You don't really know what you're going to get from their offensive line going into this SEC championship game. And not just with this LSU offensive line, but just this LSU team in general. Because when they played Tennessee, they got stomped. And I kind of thought that it was going to be a really good game. And it wasn't. And Georgia, yes, they are the best team in college football, but they're not unbeatable. Okay, we saw them get pushed to the wire against Missouri. Missouri has a really good defense. We saw Kentucky give Georgia a little bit of a game. Now, the result was never in question. You watch that Kentucky game, there wasn't really a moment where I think too many of us were like, oh yeah, Georgia has a shot at losing this thing. Like, nah. You get what I'm saying? Like, Georgia wasn't impressive in that win. It definitely wasn't one of their better performances. However, they showed that they cannot muscle you. And for LSU, I think that they need to look at last year's SEC championship game when Alabama came into this game and they were underdogs in a lot of people's eyes. You remember what the narrative was about Alabama going into that 2021 SEC championship game? A lot of people thought that Georgia was not only going to beat Alabama, but they were going to do it emphatically. And what did Alabama do? the week after their offensive line was terrible against Auburn in the Iron Bowl, they have their best performance all season against the best defensive line in college football that year with Jordan Davis. I mean, there were a lot of monsters on that defensive line that Georgia had. And in that SEC championship game, Nick Saban and company were able to find a way to get the most out of that offensive line. For LSU, you got to be able to do the same thing. Now, I don't know what Brian Kelly can do to get his offensive line playing at a high level for this game, but you got to do something. You know, maybe take him out to eat, take him to Ruth Chris, get him a nice little steak, get him a little pumped up for this game. Be like, you know, I'm taking y'all out to eat because I'm just trying to reward you guys for how you played this season, you know, and we need you guys to have your best game of the year. So we want you guys to have the best meal of the year. So we're going to take you out to Ruth Chris. You know, get them boys some steaks. Get them big boys some steaks, man. Them big boys love to eat. I'm pretty sure they'll love a nice little steak at Ruth Chris. You know, just give them a little added motivation for this game, man. But all jokes aside, Brian Kelly has to find a way to get this offensive line playing at a good level. Because you look at this on paper, it's a mismatch. And it's not that LSU doesn't have the talent. I mean, they have some talented guys on this offensive line. It's just that it's just been inconsistent. You know, you're still trying to get the chemistry, everything down packed. It's just been inconsistent. The offensive line is still a work in progress. You know, LSU has exceeded expectations. They've made it to the SEC championship game. And they've done it with subpar offensive line play. Now, their offensive line hasn't looked bad in every game. They definitely have had some good performances. But you don't really know what you're going to get from this unit in this game against a really good defensive line. And although the stats say that Georgia isn't great when it comes to getting consistent pressure on the quarterback, I mean, you go back and you look at that Tennessee game. I mean, they were getting after Hendon Hooker. That defense had no problem getting pressure against Tennessee's offensive line, which is pretty good. As a matter of fact, it's better than LSU's offensive line. So for LSU in this game, you know, you have to be able to win at the line of scrimmage. Not just when it comes to playing Georgia, but that's really any of the best teams in college football. You look at Michigan. Why did Ohio State lose to the Wolverines? Because Michigan was better up front. And I know I'm spending a lot of time talking about the matchup of the defensive line of Georgia versus the offensive line of LSU, but it's really important because, I mean, that's really the biggest factor outside of Jayden Daniels. Because, yeah, Jayden Daniels is going to be able to extend plays. He's going to pick up yards with his legs and buy time for receivers to get open. But at the same time, you can't ask him to do it every single play. You got to give him some help. So if Jayden Daniels is going to have a superstar performance, then his offensive line needs to have a superstar performance as well. And another thing that we can take away from last year's SEC championship game when Alabama won is that Alabama was able to get pressure on Stetson Bennett. You know, they had 3 sacks. Georgia had none. You have to be able to out-physical Georgia. You got to get physical with them. LSU has a really good defensive line. Okay, their defensive line can get pressure on the quarterback also, and they have a really good group of pass rushers. So I think that defensively, you know, I think that LSU's defense could keep them around in this game. You may be like, whoa, JT, like, how you going to say that when this is the same LSU team who couldn't stop Texas A&M and couldn't stop Tennessee? Listen. This is an LSU defense that's going against a Georgia offense that isn't Tennessee. Okay? They're not running the kind of stuff that Tennessee's running. I think that the styles of LSU's defense and Georgia's offense are a pretty good matchup. I think that LSU definitely has the capability of being able to match Georgia's physicality on the defensive side of the football with their offensive line. Their offensive line is super physical, but I think that up front, that front 7 of LSU also can be really physical at times. But another thing is that not only do you have to be physical with Georgia, but you also have to be composed. You see, last year in the SEC championship game, you look at the final score, you see Alabama 41, Georgia 24. But what if I told you at one point during that game, Alabama was trailing? Alabama was down, 10-0, 10-7? And then they ended up getting hot. And then they ended up winning the game. When you play Georgia, you can't get rattled. When you get down early, you still have to be able to keep your composure. You have to be able to stay calm. Tennessee got rattled against Georgia. And it was blatantly obvious. And not just because of the home crowd, but you could tell that the moment was just way too big for Tennessee. For LSU, the moment can never get too big for you. Every time you need to make a play, you got to execute. Every single time. Like what you did against Alabama. When LSU needed big plays against Bama, guess what? They got them. They got the 2-point conversion, which won the game for them. So, for LSU, you got to be able to get pressure on Stetson Bennett. You got to be able to match Georgia's physicality, stay composed, and lastly, win the turnover battle. Alabama had no turnovers in their win against Georgia in the SEC championship game. Georgia had 2. So you got to win the turnover margin. And you need the Jayden Daniels takeover to activate. Now for Georgia, obviously, what do you need to do to win? Well, first of all, don't turn the football over. Don't make dumb penalties, because that's the 2 common denominators for upsets. Penalties, turnovers. Third thing is, I think it's pretty simple. Don't let Jayden Daniels take over. Keep him in the pocket. Don't let him get outside the pocket. You want to keep him inside the pocket and force him to throw from inside there, because although he is a pretty good passer inside the pocket, the offensive line isn't great. So if there's no way for him to escape and the offensive line is, collapsing, what's he going to do? Nothing. So you got to be able to stop Jayden Daniels. You can't allow him to take over this game. Because if you do, it's going to be close. Because when Jayden Daniels is at his best, he's one of the best quarterbacks in college football. Think about it. He's accurate. He's dynamic with the football when he decides to tuck it and run. And most importantly, he doesn't turn the football over. So you can trust him late in games, in any situation. And for LSU, Jayden Daniels pretty much is their team. I mean, if you take out his rushing yards, this team's rushing attack, it's not that great without Jayden Daniels. So, I mean, this team is built off Jayden Daniels' performance. If Jayden Daniels plays well, this is going to be a close game. LSU has potential to win. If Jayden Daniels doesn't play well, they're going to lose. And I'm going to take Georgia to win this game. Now, I know a lot of you guys probably going to be like, oh, JT, it was pretty obvious you were going to take Georgia. Like, listen. Excuse me. LSU making it to the SEC championship this year is a huge accomplishment. I think that Brian Kelly most definitely should be in the conversation for Coach of the Year. They're probably going to give it to Sonny Dykes, but he definitely is going to be one of the 3 finalists for that award. He's done a fantastic job with this team. LSU has some pretty good wins. They beat Mississippi State. That was a really solid win. You got to win against Florida, Alabama, Ole Miss, but this is probably their toughest task. And I definitely hope that this game is competitive. I don't want to see a blowout in this game. Kind of would be a giant letdown. You definitely want to see LSU play their best football in their biggest game of the season, and you hope that they play up to the moment. I see everybody saying that Georgia's the best team in college football. Yes, they are, but they're not as good as what they were last year. They can be beat. And I definitely do expect them to be in some close games when we get to the college football playoffs. However, LSU definitely does have the recipe to pull off this upset. You got the quarterback. And you got a really good defense. Well, a defense that has potential to be really physical with Georgia. You look at Missouri. You go back and you look at that Missouri game. Missouri's defense was really getting after it. They were matching Georgia's physicality. I think that's a really good example. And then Missouri has probably one of the more underrated defenses in this conference. Same thing with Kentucky. So for LSU, if they can be physical and not get out-muscled and manhandled up front on both sides of the football, I think that this game could be close, but I am taking Georgia to get the win.